I'm going to do a video on the drainage holes of a 107 SL. I'm going to show you where the drainage holes are, how to clean them, and some horror stories of what happens if you let those drainage holes get plugged. So let's start at the rear of this car. I've already taken the carpet out and the spare wheel out. The first drainage hole you should check is in the trunk under the wheel well. The drainage hole is here at the back, and the thing to check for is that you have the rubber plug in there and it is actually not perished and rock hard like this one. This one is just lying in there and doing nothing. That should be a tight fitting plug that stops moisture getting kicked up when you're driving along. So the first thing we'll be doing is replacing that. While you're in the trunk, or the boot as we say in England, the next drainage hole is here in the battery tray, and once again when you pull that out it should have a rubber tube on the bottom of it. This is a very common rust area, and the bottom of the footwell is also a common rust area. If you're ever buying one of these cars, one of the things to look out for is to put your head underneath and see if that section is rusted out. Here's one of the things to look for. This is the underneath the back of the car where the spare tyre sits. And you can see that this particular car is completely rusted out all along here. See these massive holes, and that's just generally because the drain hole there was blocked and you had water sitting in that area for long periods of time. Just before we move away from the rear of these cars, another very common area for these cars to leak is through these back seals here. So if you've got dampness in the boot, that's one of the reasons. And another reason brings us to our next drainage hole, which is the fuel filler cap. Now there should be a drainage hole just down there. You can see the drainage hole there, and that should, if you pour a cup of water, drain to the underside of the car and not into your boot. So it's definitely worth checking that that's the case. Just before we move to the front and sides of the car, there are two drainage holes in this compartment here. The drainage holes are just here. You can see it there, I'm just pointing to it. And on this side, it's particularly clear. You should be able to get a coat hanger, a barbecue stick or something all the way down there. And if you want to test, you can put a tiny little funnel and pour some water down there to make sure it's clear. Let's have a little look on the other side, and straight away we see a complete absence of that drainage hole. It is actually here, but you can see it is completely plugged. How you clean these drainage holes out is down to you. Sometimes you can get away with just using a shashlik stick or a barbecue stick. Sometimes a long coat hanger like this will work because it's got the twisted bit on the ends, and you'll find that when you pull it up you often end up pulling up a lot of the gunk as well. As we move to the front of the car, we get to the ever more problematic and serious drain holes. And there should be a drain hole in the rear of the sill. These are the jacking holes here, those aren't drain holes. There should be a drain holes in the rear of the sill. Now this car's been repaired, it hasn't been repaired properly, which I've mentioned before. The water that drains down here drains through this hole here, and there should be a corresponding hole on the bottom, which on this car there isn't. There should be a hole just here. There are other holes alongside, and the hole just here, when you put your finger inside that hole, you should be able to find this inner channel drainage plate. There should be one on the back and one on the front, and these are welded on the inside, and as the water flows down there, it's supposed to flow down this channel and out a hole at the bottom. A common problem is that these inner channels get corroded, or they don't get cleaned out, they get forgotten about, and they end up looking like this, falling off, and the whole of your rocker panels or sills end up filling up with water and eventually will rust from the inside out. Just before we move on from these inner sill repair panels, when we come to repair that 280 SL over there, we're going to be using panel bond to bond this into the inner sill, because that'll give us a waterproof bond. And the trouble with spot welding is, which is how this will have been done in the factory, is you tend to burn off some of the primer along the joints, and that inevitably leads to rust, especially if you have any kind of sludge buildup and you're not cleaning out those drainage channels, which is why you eventually end up with something like that. Know what happens if you don't clean out those drainage channels and your sills end up with filling up with water. This car is a pretty good example here. If you have a look down there, you can see what the state of this sill looks like. Massive, great big holes here on the inner sill, and this has actually been covered with a cover plate because the outer sill was so bad, but whoever did it, apart from the fact they omitted to put the jacking point and the jacking holes in, they did not bother to put any drain holes in at all. So every time it rains with this car, water flows in there and ends up in the sill. There's another important drain hole just here. I'm just repairing this whole section here. And there is an important drain hole just here, and the idea is that water rolls through that hole out under there and drains through the sill. But what often happens is this whole section here gets filled up with crud, and that gets blocked, and you end up getting water sitting along here and eventually rusting its way through the top sill. I have covered these sills in another video, but before you start fabricating all of this, it's worth mentioning that you can get the sill repair sections. This is the front repair section here, and you can see that they do have built-in drainage holes. This here is the drainage hole that should be directly underneath there. You can see it's an oblong hole, but there are other drainage holes along this sill as well. Now, if your car is original and you want to inspect underneath these vents, you are going to have to drill out these rivets here to get this plate off, and you may also have to take off this piece of trim here, which I'm not going to get into in this particular video, but you can see on this red 280 SL. It's a good way to tell whether a car's had any attention in that area. This one's obviously been repainted, but you can see these are screws here. And not rivets, so this has all been attended to on this particular car. Just before we get to the bulkhead and one of the main problem areas of this car, there are two drainage holes, one just here and one just here. Once again, when you pour a cup of water through there, the water shouldn't pool in there. If it does, you'll find that eventually this panel here will start rusting. When you pour water through this grill here, it'll come out this channel here and roll down into this section of the car, which I will cut out. This is basically where the battery tray sits, and that is another classic rust spot for these cars, sometimes because the batteries leak and the acid burns through the metal, but more often because water sits down here in this section and the drain holes in this section are blocked. So I'm just going to show you where the actual drain holes are, because they're very difficult to find. This car's a pretty good example of what happens if you allow water to sit in this area here. I'm just going to take this panel out. It's just held in by a couple of magnets. The new panel shows you where the drainage hole is. It's right at the corner here, and 9 times out of 10 you will find that that drainage hole is blocked on your car. Temporarily secured this panel in because it's not quite cut to size yet, but the drain hole should be just there. And I'll show you what happens when that drain hole gets plugged. Eventually water sits in this seam here and starts to rust it away, and you can see that this seam is spot welded. This is where we've cut some of the old spot welds out, and as I mentioned previously, as soon as you spot weld something, you're going to burn away all the primer and rust protection around that, and if you compound that with having water sitting in there, before long this will happen. All of this section is rusted away here. All of this is really super thin metal now. You can see holes forming all along, so it's not worth trying to repair that panel. And exactly the same thing has happened here, along here, where we've cut this away from the bulkhead. This should have a flange on it like this, but where the flange has been spot welded and water has sat, it's just rusted away to nothing over the years. Just when you thought things couldn't get any worse, if you don't unblock that drain hole, you leave it blocked up with water sitting in it, what can also eventually happen is that you start to rust out this section here. See, that's got a big hole in it, which we're going to have to weld up. And then water starts sitting in here, and you can just see there what happens to the front of the car when you have water sitting in this section here. Once again, common repair is along here, simply because you've got water getting into this cross member, or whatever this section is called. On this particular car, we ended up cutting this panel. This panel comes as one huge piece normally, it's about £800, but we didn't need this section. This is where the front shock absorber goes through, and you will notice that these two holes here are also drain holes, and I'll show you on the car. Now you can see those two holes here and here, and if you look underneath the car, this is the top of the shock absorber, or strut as they're called in America. That actually corresponds with these drainage channels here and here. So once again, get something poked up there, coat hanger, a little drill bit or something, to make sure that those channels are clear, because this is another very, very common rust area. If you saw one of the videos I did on I think it was Sill's, you'll see that on that red car somebody had attempted to repair all of this, because these are a very common rust spot. You can actually buy this whole section though, so before, if you are planning on repairing your car, just go out and buy this piece rather than trying to make it up. It's so much easier. It's all too common to have leaves, dirt, grit forming on the top of here, and if you don't clean that away and it just sits there, the top of this will rust through, and once you start getting water coming through the top, obviously you will end up rusting out the bottom, and in the worst case scenario, this support strut along here will get completely rusted out as well, which is what's happened on this car. This is the inner wheel arch repair section. This is what it should look like. This is the one that came off that silver car. Most of this is all rusted away. It had also been patched several times. Once again, you can see that it's spot welded to the car, which is how it left the factory. But if you turn that over, you will see on the inside where that's spot welded, it's all rusty, and obviously here is a section where water would just be sitting, both at the bottom and on this particular car at the top. Have a look here. This has been repaired. Another drainage hole, which is often forgotten about and gets very easily blocked, is down in the lower section of this inner wheel arch here. Once again, you can see if you shine a torch underneath on this particular car, that is all starting to get rusted out here, but there should be a drainage channel at the bottom of this here, and you should check on your car to see that that is not blocked, because if it is blocked, you'll find you get this happening, an awful lot of moisture, and eventually this will rust through and you'll be up for a new inner wing. One thing you've really got to look out for if you're thinking of buying one of these cars is mechanics are very keen to cover the bottom of the cars with Underseal, and I've seen many of these SLs which are covered with Underseal, and underneath that Underseal will often hide a myriad of damage and rotten metal, which is the case here. And in the process of undersealing, what often happens is the drainage channels actually get blocked up, especially if somebody who doesn't understand how these cars are put together is doing the job. Just to finish this video, I'm going to have a quick look underneath here. I've never actually taken this off. This is the heater blower cover, and it is a huge source of rust problems for these SLs. First point to notice is there is a rubber seal between this plastic casing and the car, and those rubber seals are nearly always perished, so it's worth considering, if you are going to take this off, getting hold of another rubber seal from Mercedes or someone like Euro or the SL shop if you're in England, before you do the job. So let's have a little look inside here and see what horrors lurk beneath. Okay, not nearly as bad as it could be. So we've got a blower cover motor box off, and what happens is the water that pools in here by the windscreen wipers flows down through this box here, and it's supposed to flow out in a hose at the bottom of the car. So let's just take a cup of water, pour it down there, and see what actually happens to that water on this car. So I'm just going to pour some water, more water down there, and you should see it running through the car. And if we're lucky, take this camera and show underneath the car, you can see it. Now, well, you can see that coming from a tube there. Just before we move on, we can see why this is such a rust problem area. It's just a small example of the kind of build-up of crud you can get behind that channel. And of course, if you leave it there, water will sit there. I think we need to just get a vacuum cleaner in there, but it's just full of sand and dirt. So just need to clear out those channels and make sure the drainage holes that lead to under the car are not blocked. I'm going to leave the video here. These are beautiful cars, but if you don't unblock those drain holes, you can have untold problems in the future. I haven't covered the air conditioning pipes or anything like that, because none of these cars have air conditioning. We're not lucky enough in England to need it, but if you've got air conditioning in your car, then another source of leaks into the front footwells is through those air conditioning pipes. I think I'll do a whole separate video on the front bulkhead, how to repair it, fix it, what to look for. This video is more about drainage holes and things that you can easily do at home just to make sure that your car does not fill up with water next time it rains.